what you can convince somebody of is that the way they're painting their reality is skewed, is wrong. And from there, hope that they can come to that conclusion themselves. Anywho. Okay. Y'all might be wondering why I have Christmas attire in hell. And to that, I'd like to answer you. But I won't. Anyways, I was sent an article earlier today, and I wanted to go over it with you all. And it's called The Brain Under the Influence of Power. And there's certainly some conversations that need to be had with this particular article, but we'll get into those here in a second. So first, as per usual, let's get into the fan art section. So this one we have is from Red Joker. Salem Sky suggested I edit Waving Blizzy GIF and give him a lighter, so I did, and he is ready for the next Crush 40 concert. Apparently we're going to have a lot of Waving Blizzy emotes in the chat now, because Red Joker is also the person who made the original Waving Blizzy emote. And now we have this. Unfortunately, we can't use the lighter one as well, because I'm only allowed a set number of animated slots, and I don't want to get, like, a thing animated, and then immediately have to tell an artist, like, hey, your emote's being taken off of the list because I used all of my slots. That would make me feel bad. So, that said, let's go ahead and move on to the next one. We have, with no context, as per usual, one from Karamba. This appears to be more of a himbo Suris. And, yeah, it'd be there. The last one we have here is from Mathematical Cabbage. Said, Timer-kun wants a dance. And while we are not currently in a subathon, some things have come up recently that may require another thing. Maybe not a subathon, but yeah. Anyways, fuck that timer. He can die. As always, everybody, thank you for your fan art submissions. If you want your fan art to be shown in a future episode, the best way to do so is to drop by and put it into the Discord section that is labeled fan art. Because I can't speak, even though I've said this phrase 1,012,000,000 times. Here we be. Anywho, let's go ahead and get into the article. It's called The Brain Under the Influence of Power. And it's a couple years old, but it was sent to me, and I wanted to go ahead and take a look at it specifically. So the article is from Psychology Today, and it does begin by saying, power is an important social lens through which we interact with others and society. The powerful have more influence on others and greater access to valuable resources, such as food, education, jobs, and potential mates. The powerless have less access to these resources and are often dependent on the powerful. Ordinary people can get intoxicated by power or powerful roles. Just temporarily wearing a power-symbolizing uniform can recode brain processes to create a new mindset. An infamous 1971 Stanford University experiment showed the extent of behavior changes when in uniform. One, Philippe Zimbardo and colleagues built a mock prison in the basement of Stanford University's psychology department. Each participant was randomly assigned to play a guard or a prisoner. Guards dressed like guards were given whistles, whereas prisoners dressed like prisoners with identification numbers stamped on their smocks. The initial plan was to observe students for 2 weeks, but the study had to terminate in 6 days. The guards became aggressive, insulting, and humiliating, whereas the prisoners became passive, helpless, and emotionally disturbed. So let's go ahead and stop this for just a moment. Most people know about the Stanford prison experiment, right? At least I would hope so. Now, there is something to note with it. We don't really have a good peer review for the Stanford prison experiment. A lot of the stuff in it was not easily replicatable, and due to the ethics of the experiment itself, trying to replicate any of the results in the Stanford prison experiment would create its own bucket of issues as well. There was a lack of oversight with the experiment itself. So while we do have interesting anecdotes to pull from the Stanford prison experiment, we don't necessarily have any conclusions. We actually cannot draw full-on conclusions from the Stanford prison experiment. The things we did learn from it are important, mind you, but we have to taper them with a grain of salt because of the nature of how, well, these results were harvested. So correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the Stanford prison experience largely considered bollocks at this point? That's kind of what I'm getting at. It's not so much that it's entirely bullshit. It's that the experiment itself lacks so many of the key features of a good, rigorous study, and especially an ethical study, that trying to pull any concrete conclusions out of it is nigh impossible. There are great generalizations that can be made from the prison experiment. We can ascertain that for a lot of people, power does corrupt, but if memory serves, with the Stanford prison experiment, the guards were also told to be more aggressive during it as well, weren't they? Like, they were given blatantly unethical things to do with the prisoners as a way to see if they would actually do them. So, as opposed to being a, and there was no control group either. There's nothing showing that this wouldn't or would happen in different areas. Like I said, there's a lot of important pieces of what we would consider to be a good study that are just missing in the Stanford prison experiment. But that does not mean that it was not useful. It just means that it was not conclusive. Now, let's go ahead and continue with the article itself. I did want to note that because if the foundation of the article really hinges on the results of the Stanford prison experiment, then we need to go ahead and walk in with the foundation, knowing that, well, that's a bit of a shoddy foundation to work with. A more recent and ethical iteration of the experiment was conducted at McMaster University in 2017. Canadian university students wore either police uniforms or mechanics overalls and performed a task while encountering distractions during the main task. Examples of distractions were pictures of people wearing clothing associated with low socioeconomic status, hoodies, or wearing clothing associated with high socioeconomic status, suits. The researchers wanted to explore the link between wearing power symbolizing a uniform and the extent to which high or low SES distractors shift the participants' attention away from a certain task. So this is a little bit different. This seems to be focusing more on whether or not a person will actually pay attention to somebody who looks like they should be paid attention to. In other words, the slower the reaction time during the task, the more distracting and salient the picture, low or high SES. The participants were biased towards low socioeconomic distractors only when they were wearing police-styled uniforms. The results are reminiscent of police profiling, in which low-status groups are more salient to and capturing of police officers' attention. The brains of powerful individuals react differently to social cues in ways that resemble psychopaths or patients with frontal brain damage. Psychopaths and some patients with brain damage lack empathy and the ability to take others' perspectives. Research has shown that power can deform the brain to act in the same ways. For example, people with high status have been shown to be less accurate in judging the emotions of people with low status. So there's a bit of a terminology thing that we need to talk about as well here. So the term psychopath is not actually utilized by the DSM-5 anymore. DSM-4 did use psychopathy and sociopathy as determining factors for people. Those were things you could call somebody, but now it's all considered being part of the ASPD spectrum or the antisocial personality disorder spectrum. I do want to note that that's another knock where the article is concerned. While we might be able to pull something good from the article, while we might be able to get some interesting conclusions from the experiments here, I did want everybody to note that the language that's being used here is a little bit outdated. Though it does seem that it was mainly using the Stanford prison experiment not as a foundation for the article, but instead as an example of this style of experiment being used before. It is agitating that it did not... It seemed to only allude to the ethical quandaries with the Stanford prison experiment, but it didn't seem to actually talk about any of the conclusions. And that seems a little weird to me. Not game-breaking weird, but a little awkward to me. But let's go ahead and continue. In a clever paradigm, researchers explored the relationship between empathy-related brain areas and power status. They compared the extent of mirroring indirectly related to processes underlying empathy in people who were primed with higher low power scenarios using transradial magnetic stimulation. Priming was done by having participants at a baseline write an essay on a specific incident in which they had more power over another person, or write an essay in which someone had power over them. Then participants in both groups, high and low power, watched videos of another person's actions. As a transcranial. Okay, I can't read. I'm sorry. I'm dumb. Continuing on, our human brains have mirror neural networks, meaning that similar brain areas are activated when observing the actions of others. If you've ever experienced secondhand driving, you get the point. For example, if you're a piano player and you observe another person playing the piano, the motor areas of your brain light up too. Astonishingly, this mirroring vanishes in people under the influence of power. Just priming the participant with power, writing about an incident in which you had power, decreased the mirroring of others' actions. This creates an asymmetry in relationships between the powerful and the powerless. In other words, the powerless are more attentive to the uniqueness of the powerful, and the powerful perceive the powerless in accordance with general stereotypes. Read Racism and the Brain. Some researchers called this the default effect of power resulting in reduced interpersonal sensitivity. A myriad of research has shown that powerful people are more likely to rely on stereotypes. I'm not going to lie, there are a couple of examples of this that come directly to my mind, and I don't think it's necessarily that you have to be in power. I think, based on my experience, I think someone merely has to perceive that they're in power. Think about if you've got a friend who might be racist. Usually, if you are racist, generally speaking, you do believe that there are aspects about your race that are better than aspects about someone else's race. And this creates a bit of a feedback loop, right? This creates a feedback loop where somebody who's already primed to believe that they are better than somebody in another race is now going to find more negative stereotypes for other people's races and rely on that. Sam says, I missed the start. Why are we covering the article? So we're covering the article because this ends up working as a very good commentary for people who deem themselves superior to others in any way, shape, or form, be it politicians or everyday racists, or, somebody who just thinks that they're better than a trans person, anybody with like a particular kind of bigotry. Typically, when you engage in a particular type of bigotry, you believe that there is a styling of that relationship where you are more powerful than them. And I think, at least based on what's in the article, me and the person writing the article would agree that all one has to do is perceive that they are in power compared to somebody else, and then suddenly that's all that's required for them to do things like relying on stereotypes more than anything else. Vigor says, I'm too powerful to care about the specifics of you. I mean, that would be the underlying logic, but what the article is getting at is there is not an underlying logic to it. There's not a component of this where somebody thinks about it. It's all subconscious. It's just what happens with the brain so long as it's been primed first. When somebody walks out wearing a suit and they are primed to believe that they are better than people who are not in suits, they tend to look at people who are not in suits or wearing like urban wear. They tend to look at them a lot more disfavoringly. Adam Galinsky and colleagues showed that powerful people also tend to anchor the world in their perspective. They prime participants with higher low power, similar to the priming explained in the previous paragraph, and then ask them to write the letter E on their foreheads. The participants can write it in the direction they would read it, but is reversed to others, self-oriented, or in the direction others would read it, but reversed to themselves. Power ended up being associated with writing a self-oriented E, which was reversed to others. That's interesting. So there was a higher likelihood that people would do things in such a way where it just benefited them, but inconvenienced everyone else as a cost of that. That's interesting. Next one says, power schemas, as described above, may not extend to collectivist societies. In fact, in collectivist societies, power that is disruptive to societal harmony would be rejected. The brain, under the influence of power in individualistic societies, seems to de-individuate the powerless and allow the powerful to practice full individuation. Successful leaders in such societies succeed not because they are powerful, but because they understand the importance of acknowledging the uniqueness of every person blind to their power status. New leaders should be trained on how to disambiguate power from true leadership. Okay, so that gives me... Oh, they've actually got references here too, which is useful. So that leads me to believe then as well, personally, that if somebody were... if somebody were in a position, let's say a white supremacist of some flavor, were to believe that they as an individual were better genetically or some other means to somebody who was a different race, and then they would collectively view people of that different race as an entire unit, a hive mind, a hegemony. Wouldn't that mean that you simultaneously believe you are more powerful, but then can develop a victim complex as a result? The article seems to support that idea. And if that's the case, then that's certainly a lens we need to consider whenever we are approaching conversations about any individual. If you're having a conversation with somebody who's been saying problematic things or is just in general harboring a lot of bigotry towards particular groups, ask some priming questions. See if you can get them to come to the core of realizing that the out group is not a hive mind, and the in group is not merely an individual. It is not just comprised of like multiple individuals that are all like vocal minorities. Said mean actual competent people can be in power, but more often than not. So what are some good examples of questions? So a good example of one to try to jar somebody out of that mindset would be, so I have a question. Do you believe that, let's say they're talking about black people, do you believe all black people think this one thing? Let's say it's a random stereotype. Think of a random black stereotype you can utilize. Let's say we just go with a generally problematic one, the idea that all black people like fried chicken, right? That's one that a lot of people fall back on for jokes and things like that. Yeah, KFC. That's one that people fall back on all the time. So if you've got somebody that tries to think that like, all black people are operating the exact same way, they're going to replace us, some nonsense like that. Then they say something about chicken, just ask like, do you think that all black people love fried chicken? And if they answer yes, well, now we have the Socratic method. This is one of the easiest tools in your pocket, which is merely just asking, why do you think that at the end of a statement? So if they go, yes, all black people like fried chicken, that's a thing. Okay, what about black people who are vegans? Like, don't even bring in like food preferences as a result. Just pop in and just go, okay, what about people who literally just don't eat meat? Oh, well, that's different. Okay, but you said that all of them. So get them to understand at that point, do you recognize that you just moved the goalposts? Do you recognize that your first statement included everybody and your second statement necessarily didn't? Is it that you changed your perspectives halfway through? Or can I not trust anything you say? Sam says, I feel like if they answered yes, they would say yes, most do. From experience, if they were to say yes, most do, then you could also point out that most white people like fried chicken too. What's the difference? What's the qualifying factor between these two? What makes these two conversations any different? If we're going to go with an argument like most like X, and then we're going to attach a racial component to X, get them to qualify the racial component. If most black people like fried chicken, and if most white people like fried chicken, then of what value is the statement, most black people like fried chicken? Of what value does that statement hold? And to what end are you saying it? A fun one to do in situations like this as well is if somebody tries to go, well, it's just a joke. That's always a fun one, because then you can go, well, then can you explain the joke to me? I don't really find it funny. Can you explain the joke? I would like to laugh as well. I would like to know what's funny about the joke. That would be helpful to me. But basically, get them to say a statement that necessarily paints everybody who they've otherized as being one hive mind, and then just give a soft example of how that statement is false, and then ask them, do they believe that statement? When they move the goalpost, which typically they will, you can then continue the conversation from there. They've now moved the goalpost. They've now had to have the conversation with you about how what they said before doesn't really count. And after about 2 or 3 times of this happening in the conversation, because it will, the next question is, how many statements are you going to make that you will then have to backpedal? And if it is a significant amount, why are we having a conversation in any case? Of what value are your opinions? Ideally, you won't have to go that far, because at that point, you're just insulting the person. Like, the statement is true. Their opinions on this have stopped holding any real weight or value because they've shifted like liquid repeatedly throughout the conversation. But instead, maybe use the language, because that's what I would want to say. Instead, go, so we agree that your previous statements about insert group here weren't necessarily true of the entire group, but we agree that you originally said they were about the entire group. Yes? If they're an honest person, they will likely agree with that. They'll agree that they said one thing 10 minutes ago, and now that we're in the here and now, they're saying something different. Then you can go, okay, then can we agree that your perspective has changed? If you say, can we agree that your perspective was wrong? They'll immediately get on the back foot and start defending their original points again. But if you ask, has your perspective changed? It's a more open-ended question. While they can answer with a yes or a no, you can always ask them to follow up with a qualifier. The goal is to get somebody in these positions to realize that they believe they are in a position of power over another group, and that they are creating a victim mindset for themselves. Here's the thing, though. You usually won't convince somebody of that. What you can convince somebody of is that the way they're painting their reality is skewed, is wrong. And from there, hope that they can come to that conclusion themselves. Because if they end up coming to that conclusion themselves, then congratulations, you've done the most important bit. You've gotten them to think. But the meat of the article itself is about whether or not power affects the mind. And the conclusions of the article are that it does. My extrapolation from that would be the perception of power is all that's required for that to happen. But that's just my extrapolation. I would maybe want to follow up with the person who wrote this. It does seem that the idea that somebody in power starts to look at people not as other individuals like themselves, but as collectives. And it's very easy to view yourself as the victim if you feel like you're an individual whilst everybody else is part of a collective. I feel like this is a thing that also extends to content creators as well, because it's undeniable that the parasocial nature of our relationship with most viewers does create a world where we hold, however slight, a not unremarkable amount of power over other people. So maybe it's a good idea as content creators for us also to make sure that we're not, say, looking at chat as chat, and instead looking at chat as Vagary, Red Joker, Ryoko, and Sweet Melody, and Salem Sky, and everybody else who happens to be in chat as individuals, as opposed to just a giant cacophony of noise. Hopefully. But I did think it was an interesting article, and I wanted to go ahead and take a look at it for this segment. Nothing super controversial, nothing, I need to talk about all of the ways I disagree with this. Just looking at a thing, pointing out a couple of issues that I did have with the examples given, but mainly giving people something to chew on. A little bit different than usual, but I figure it's a welcome break from everything else I cover, at least sometimes. And let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. If you want any more stuff like this, where I just cover things, as opposed to strictly trying to go in and fight desperately against a thing, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already, subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, everybody, insert end of video tagline here.